The pungent scent of engine oil and gasoline hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume in the cathedral of chrome and steel that was Vince's custom cycles. Sunlight, filtered through the grime-streaked windows, cast long shadows across the concrete floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Darnell Cooper, his hands calloused and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 repairs, tightened the last bolt on a vintage Indian chief. The rhythmic clink of his wrench against metal, a sound as comforting to him as a lullaby, echoed in the cavernous space. He ran a hand over the gleaming chrome, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. Another resurrection complete. Another machine coaxed back to life. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a surgeon of steel, a whisperer of engines. Vince, his face creased with a forced smile that never quite reached his eyes, bustled over, his cheap cologne preceding him like a noxious gas. "Darnell, we've got a special client. Needs a look-see at his Harley." The way Vince hesitated, the subtle shift in his tone, pricked at Darnell's senses. Special client. What was that supposed to mean? Vince wasn't usually so cryptic. A flicker of unease, small and insistent, began to tap at the edges of Darnell's calm. He followed Vince towards the back of the shop, the rhythmic thump of his own heart a counterpoint to the low rumble emanating from the new arrival. And then he saw him, leather-clad, broad-shouldered, a figure that radiated a quiet, dangerous energy. The patch on the back of his vest a winged skull, the infamous insignia of the Hells Angels, left no room for misinterpretation. Darnell felt the familiar tightening in his gut, the instinctive caution that came with years of living in the Central Valley, where the lines between the law and the lawless often blurred. But beneath that initial wariness, a different feeling stirred. Curiosity, respect. These men, these riders lived by their own code, a code that Darnell, in his own solitary way, understood. They judged him for the vest. Big mistake. They didn't know him. They didn't know the quiet strength that resided beneath his calm exterior, the unwavering integrity that guided his every action. "You Darnell." The biker's voice was surprisingly gentle, a rumbling bass that resonated in the confines of the shop. Royce Benton. The name echoed faintly in Darnell's memory. He'd heard whispers, rumors of a man who commanded respect, a man whose word was law. "Yeah," Darnell replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the complex emotions swirling within. He met Royce's gaze, his own expression unreadable. He wouldn't flinch. He wouldn't show fear. These were the rules of the game, the unspoken language of the streets. Royce gestured towards his Harley, a gleaming beast of chrome and steel. "She's been acting up, backfiring, losing power. You ride it like you stole it," Darnell observed, his gaze sweeping over the machine, already cataloging the potential problems. He detected a slight misalignment in the rear wheel, a subtle but telling sign. A ghost of a smile touched Royce's lips. "Is there any other way?" Vince hovered nervously, his eyes darting between Darnell and Royce like a trapped sparrow. "Darnell's the best we got," he blurted out, his voice unnaturally high-pitched. "He knows Harley's inside and out." The desperation in Vince's tone grated on Darnell's nerves. He didn't need Vince to vouch for him. His work spoke for itself. Royce ignored Vince, his attention focused on Darnell. "You're the only one who really knows what the hell he's doing around here," he said, his words carrying an unexpected weight. A statement of fact, not a compliment. But coming from Royce, it felt like both. Darnell felt a strange sense of kinship, an unspoken understanding between two men who valued skill and honesty above all else. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken pact forming between them. Darnell knelt beside the Harley, his hands moving with practiced ease, his mind already dissecting the intricate workings of the machine. The subtle scent of burnt oil, the telltale ticking of the engine, the slight vibration beneath his fingertips, they all spoke to him, revealing the secrets hidden beneath the chrome and steel. He was in his element, lost in the familiar ritual of diagnosis and repair. The unease that had gnawed at him earlier began to recede, replaced by a quiet focus, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just fixing a motorcycle. He was forging a connection, building a bridge between two worlds that rarely intersected. The world of respectability, represented by Vince's nervous hovering, and the world of the outlaw, embodied by Royce's quiet strength. And in that moment, Darnell knew which world he truly belonged to. The world where actions spoke louder than words, where loyalty and integrity were valued above all else. He didn't yet know how, but he knew that this encounter, this seemingly insignificant repair, would change the course of his life. The air in the shop, thick with the scent of oil and anticipation, crackled with unspoken possibilities. The acrid tang of burnt rubber hung heavy in the air, a familiar scent Darnell had come to associate with the rhythm of his life. The whirring of the grinder against steel was a meditative hum, a counterpoint to the chaotic jumble of thoughts that cluttered his mind. Royce's bike, a gleaming Harley-Davidson Road King, sat disassembled on the lift, its guts splayed open like a patient awaiting surgery. Darnell's hands, calloused and scarred from years of wrestling with engines, moved with practiced ease, tightening bolts, adjusting cables, his focus unwavering. He found a strange peace in the meticulousness of his work, a temporary sanctuary from the ever-present hum of uncertainty that vibrated beneath the surface of his everyday life. He wasn't a man of many words, preferring the language of mechanics, the tangible truth of metal and oil. Each precise movement, each carefully calibrated adjustment, was a testament to his skill, a quiet defiance against the nagging voice of self-doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. He knew his worth, even if others didn't. He glanced at Royce, the burly biker leaning against the workbench, his arms crossed, a stoic observer. The Hell's Angels patch on his leather vest, a symbol often met with fear and prejudice, held no intimidation for Darnell. He saw the man, not the insignia. Royce had treated him with respect, a courtesy often lacking in the world outside the garage. Darnell had heard whispers amongst the other mechanics, cautious glances thrown his way when Royce arrived. They treated the biker's presence like a contamination, a dangerous element that could tarnish the shop's reputation. Darnell found their fear baffling. A man's character wasn't defined by the patch he wore, but by the way he treated others. Royce had been nothing but courteous, patiently explaining the issues with his bike, acknowledging Darnell's expertise with a quiet nod of respect. Darnell respected that. He valued quiet competence, the ability to do a job well, without fanfare, a trait he saw reflected in the biker's steady gaze. He could feel Zach's eyes on him from across the garage, the younger mechanic's usual playful banter replaced with an unsettling silence. Darnell felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched, scrutinized. He caught Zach fiddling with his phone, the screen's glow reflecting in his eyes, a fleeting smirk playing on his lips. Something about that smirk felt wrong, like a predator sizing up its prey. Darnell dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the lingering tension he'd been carrying since his argument with his landlord. He'd been late on rent again, the mounting bills a constant pressure, threatening to crush him beneath their weight. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Not now. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand, the rhythmic click of the wrench, a small measure of control in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. He needed to finish this job, earn his pay, and put food on the table. Everything else could wait. The metallic screech of a dropped tool echoed through the garage, momentarily shattering the quiet concentration. Darnell flinched, his hand instinctively tightening around the wrench. He glanced up, his gaze meeting Zach's across the room. The younger mechanic's face was carefully blank, his eyes flickering away, a faint flush creeping up his neck. He mumbled an apology, his voice strained and bent to retrieve the tool. Darnell felt a knot tighten in his gut, a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. He watched as Zach straightened, his hand slipping into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his phone. The small, seemingly innocuous gesture sent a shiver down Darnell's spine. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself he was being paranoid, but the unease remained, a persistent hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. Later that afternoon, the quiet hum of the garage was replaced by a different kind of buzz, a low murmur that rippled through the air like a gathering storm. Darnell, lost in the intricacies of rewiring the Road King's headlight, was oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. His focus narrowed to the delicate task at hand. He barely registered Vince's approach, the shop owner's usually jovial demeanor replaced by a grim set to his jaw. Vince cleared his throat, the sound sharp and abrupt, finally piercing through Darnell's concentration. He looked up, his brow furrowed in question, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Vince held out his phone, the screen displaying a photo Darnell working on Royce's bike, the Hell's Angels patch prominent in the frame. The caption underneath, "Guess who's patching up the Angels today?" sent a jolt of icy dread through Darnell's veins. He felt a sudden rush of understanding, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, Zach's unusual silence, his furtive glances, the smirk on his face. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a sickening realization of the trap he'd unwittingly walked into. He stared at the image, his mind racing, trying to process the implications. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd simply done his job, treated a customer with respect, regardless of his affiliation. But the photo, taken out of context, twisted into a narrative of collusion, painted a picture that was far from the truth. He looked at Vince, his eyes pleading for understanding, for a flicker of the loyalty he thought they shared. But Vince's face was a mask of cold disapproval, his eyes reflecting not understanding, but fear, and something else, something darker betrayal. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken accusations, the weight of it pressing down on Darnell, suffocating him. The hum of the garage, once a comfort, now felt like a mocking echo of the life he was about to lose. The fluorescent lights of Vince's custom cycles hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Darnell's unease. The usual Friday morning bustle felt different, charged with an unspoken tension that prickled his skin. He caught snippets of hushed conversations, furtive glances thrown his way, quickly averted when he met their gaze. A knot tightened in his gut. Something was off. Vince, usually boisterous and present, remained confined to his office, the glass door a shimmering barrier. Darnell tried to catch his eye, a silent plea for acknowledgement, but Vince remained absorbed in paperwork, his shoulders hunched as if bearing a heavy weight. The metallic tang of oil and gasoline, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag, the rough fabric a small, familiar anchor in a sea of uncertainty. What the hell is going on? The question echoed in the hollow space of his thoughts. He'd arrived early, as always, the quiet solitude of the shop a balm before the day's chaos. But this morning, the silence felt oppressive, pregnant with an unspoken accusation. He busied himself with a disassembled engine, the intricate workings a welcome distraction. The rhythmic click of his tools, the smooth slide of metal against metal, usually soothed his mind. Today, they offered little solace. The feeling of being watched persisted, a phantom presence in the periphery of his awareness. Zach, his younger colleague, sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. That smirk, Darnell realized, held a new edge, a hint of something unpleasant lurking beneath the surface. "Morning, Darnell," Zach drawled, the casual greeting laced with a strange, almost mocking tone. Darnell's unease intensified. "Morning," he replied, his voice tight. He could feel the oil clinging to his skin, a greasy film mirroring the grime he sensed in the atmosphere. Zach leaned against a workbench, his phone held casually in his hand. He flicked through something, his eyes darting between the screen and Darnell's face. "You see the comments on my story yesterday?" He held up the phone, displaying a picture. Darnell's blood ran cold. It was him, working on Royce's bike, the Hell's Angels insignia stark against the gleaming chrome. Beneath it, a string of comments scrolled, each one a venomous barb twisting into his gut. Darnell switching teams, he's in deep. Now Vince is going down, the words blurred before his eyes. He felt a dizzying rush of disbelief, anger, a chilling premonition of the storm brewing on the horizon. He snatched the phone, his fingers trembling. He scrolled through the comments, each one a fresh wound. The casual cruelty, the gleeful speculation, the insidious whispers weaving a narrative of betrayal and deceit. His stomach churned. This can't be happening. He handed the phone back, his hand shaking. He felt exposed, vulnerable, a butterfly pinned under a magnifying glass. The shop, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage. You think it's funny? Darnell's voice was low, strained. A flicker of something akin to fear crossed Zach's face, quickly replaced by a mask of bravado. Relax, man, it's just a joke, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He backed away slightly, his eyes darting around the shop as if seeking an escape route. A joke. The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. Darnell felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't a joke. This was a carefully crafted attack, a deliberate act of sabotage. He looked at Zach, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. The arrogance, the casual cruelty, the carefully cultivated image of the harmless prankster, it was all a facade, a shield concealing something darker, more malicious. The rest of the day unfolded in a slow-motion nightmare. Customers, usually eager to engage with him, now avoided his gaze, their faces etched with suspicion. The whispers followed him like shadows, clinging to him like the stench of gasoline. Each averted glance, each hushed conversation, was a confirmation of the damage done. The photograph, a single moment frozen in time, had become a weapon wielded with devastating precision. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a chilling realization of how quickly trust could be eroded, how easily reputation could be shattered. He tried to catch Vince's eye, hoping for a word of support, a gesture of reassurance. But Vince remained hidden in his office, a prisoner of his own fear. Darnell knew then, with a sickening certainty, that he was alone. The shop, once a symbol of his skill and dedication, now felt like a battlefield. He was fighting a war he hadn't started, a war against whispers and shadows, a war against the insidious power of misinformation. And as the day drew to a close, he knew, with a heavy heart, that he was losing. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to mock him, a constant reminder of the silence that had become his prison. The smell of oil and gasoline, once a comfort, now clung to him like a shroud. He walked out into the evening air, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The night stretched before him, vast and uncertain, a reflection of the darkness that had settled in his soul. The stale, metallic scent of oil and exhaust hung heavy in Vince's office, a stark contrast to the pristine chrome and polished leather of the showroom beyond. The Saturday afternoon sun, filtered through the blinds, cast stripes across Vince's mahogany desk, illuminating dust motes dancing in the otherwise still air. Darnell stood before him, a coiled spring of anger and disbelief, the termination letter crumpled in his fist. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The injustice of it all, the raw betrayal, churned in his gut like a bad engine. He'd given Vince 10 years of dedicated work, his skill and reputation intertwined with the growth of Vince's custom cycles. And for what? A photo. A goddamn photo. Vince, settled into his high-backed chair, seemed smaller than usual, his usual bluster replaced with a nervous fidgeting. He avoided Darnell's gaze, picking at a loose thread on his expensive suit. The silence stretched, each tick of the clock on the wall amplifying the tension in the room. Darnell watched him, the simmering rage battling with a deep, hollow ache. He'd respected Vince, trusted him. Now, all that was left was a bitter taste of disillusionment. So, Darnell's voice was rougher than he intended, each word a forced exhale. Care to explain this? He tossed the crumpled letter onto the desk. The paper landed with a soft thud, a pathetic punctuation mark to his decade of service. Vince flinched, finally lifting his eyes to meet Darnell's. There was a flicker of something in those eyes, a mix of guilt and annoyance, quickly masked by a forced composure. He cleared his throat, a nervous gesture Darnell had seen 1,000 times on customers haggling over prices. Only this time, it wasn't about a few dollars. It was about Darnell's livelihood, his reputation. You got a lot of nerve bringing that to me, Darnell. Vince's voice was strained, lacking its usual booming confidence. Darnell could practically hear the gears turning in his head, calculating the best way to minimize the damage, to protect his precious image. Nerve, Darnell repeated, a cold laugh escaping his lips. He could feel the anger rising, a tide threatening to overwhelm him. I spent 10 years building this place with you, Vince. 10 years of sweat and blood. And you fire me over a picture? It's not a good fit anymore, Darnell, Vince said, his voice taking on a practiced tone of finality. The image, the reputation of the shop. He trailed off, as if the words themselves were distasteful. Darnell's mind raced. He saw the photograph Royce's bike, the gleaming chrome reflecting the harsh garage lights, his own hands, calloused and grease-stained, adjusting the carburetor. A perfectly ordinary day at the shop, now twisted into something sinister, something threatening. He treated Royce like any other customer, with respect and professionalism, oblivious to the ripple effect it would cause. It ain't about no damn photo. Darnell's voice was low, laced with disgust. You're afraid of what people think, not what's real. He saw a flicker of recognition in Vince's eyes, a momentary crack in his carefully constructed facade, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced with a hardened resolve. The online forums are buzzing, Darnell. Bloggers, news sites, they're all talking about it. Associating my shop with, he hesitated, as if the mere mention of the Hell's Angels would taint the air in his office. Darnell felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd known the risks associated with working on bikes for any motorcycle club, but he'd never discriminated. A bike was a bike, a machine that deserved respect and care, regardless of who owned it. So that's it, Darnell asked, his voice hollow. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. He knew, in that moment, that there was no reasoning with Vince. The man was blinded by fear, by the perceived threat to his carefully curated image. He'd chosen public perception over loyalty, over fairness. I'm sorry, Darnell, Vince said, his voice laced with a false sincerity that grated on Darnell's nerves. It's just business. Darnell stared at him, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. He wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice. But the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked towards the door, the metallic scent of the shop suddenly suffocating. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Vince, the man who had been his mentor, his boss, now just a stranger hiding behind a mask of fear and self-preservation. He felt a pang of something akin to pity, a fleeting understanding of the weakness that drove Vince's actions. Then he walked out, leaving the stifling confines of Vince's office behind, stepping into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of a Saturday afternoon that held the weight of an uncertain future. The roar of a passing motorcycle echoed in the air, a reminder of the passion that had once defined his life, a passion he now had to reclaim, to rebuild, piece by fractured piece. The anger was still there, a simmering ember beneath the ashes of disappointment. But alongside it, a new resolve began to take root, a determination to prove them all wrong, to rise above the ashes and forge his own path. The stale air hung heavy in Darnell's small apartment, thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the metallic tang of despair. The rhythmic tick of the wall clock, usually a comforting background hum, now grated on his nerves, each second a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of his composure. Saturday night bled into Sunday morning, the darkness outside mirroring the storm raging within him. His hands, usually calloused and sure, trembled slightly as he picked at the peeling paint on his kitchen table. He could still feel the phantom vibrations of a wrench in his grip, the satisfying click of a perfectly tightened bolt. Muscle memory, a cruel reminder of a life that had been ripped from him. The insistent buzz of his phone cut through the oppressive silence. He stared at the unknown number, a flicker of apprehension twisting in his gut. He hadn't spoken to anyone from Vince's since it happened. The image of Vince's face, contorted in a mask of panicked disapproval, flashed before his eyes. The words, clipped and cold, echoed in his ears. I can't have this kind of association with my shop, Darnell. It's bad for business. Association. As if he were some kind of criminal. He swallowed the bitter taste of injustice rising in his throat. With a sigh that scraped against the raw edges of his emotions, he answered, "Hello, Darnell? It's Leo." Leo, one of the younger mechanics at Vince's. Quiet, kept to himself mostly. Darnell hadn't had much interaction with him, but he'd always seemed decent. "Leo," he acknowledged, his voice rough with disuse. He rubbed a hand over his tired face, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to relive the humiliation, the gnawing sense of betrayal. "Heard what happened," Leo said, his voice low, tinged with an awkward sympathy. "That was wrong, bro. I'm sorry." Darnell closed his eyes, the words a small balm on the raw wound of his pride. Sorry, a hollow consolation, yet a flicker of warmth amidst the coldness of his isolation. He'd expected condemnation, whispers behind his back, the silent judgment of his colleagues. He hadn't expected this. "Thanks, Leo," he managed, the words catching in his throat. He wondered what Leo knew, what he'd heard. The rumors were probably spreading like wildfire, twisting and distorting the truth with each retelling. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the static hum of the phone line. Darnell could almost hear the gears turning in Leo's mind, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. "Look," Leo finally said, his voice hesitant. "I saw Zach taking pictures that day. He was snickering about it, showing them off to some of the other guys." Zach. The name sparked a flicker of anger in Darnell's chest, a small ember in the desolate landscape of his emotions. Zach, with his cocky grin and his constant need to be the center of attention. He'd seen him hovering around the bike that day, his phone in hand, but he hadn't thought anything of it. He'd trusted, foolishly, that his colleagues wouldn't do this to him. A cold, hard knot of suspicion began to form in Darnell's stomach. He'd initially dismissed the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding, Vince overreacting to a harmless photograph. But Leo's words, hesitant yet charged with unspoken meaning, chipped away at the facade of his acceptance. What if it wasn't a misunderstanding? What if it was deliberate? The thought, once a distant whisper, now resonated with a chilling clarity. "What kind of pictures?" he asked, his voice tight with a sudden, sharp tension. Leo hesitated. Darnell could hear him shift on the other end of the line, the rustling of fabric against the receiver. "Just you working on a bike." But he was making a big deal about it, saying stuff about you being chummy with the Angels. Darnell's grip tightened on the edge of the table, the wood groaning under the pressure. The pieces began to click into place, forming a grim, unsettling picture. Zach's snickering, Vince's panicked reaction, the carefully worded dismissal. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup, a calculated move to get rid of him. But why? The question gnawed at him, a persistent itch beneath his skin. He'd never given anyone reason to target him. He'd always kept his head down, focused on his work, avoided office politics. He was good at his job, respected by his colleagues. So why? A sudden thought, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through the fog of his confusion. Trevor Baines, the owner of Reeves Body Paint, Vince's main competitor. He'd heard rumors, whispers of underhanded tactics, of sabotage. Could Baines be behind this? Could he have somehow orchestrated the whole thing, using Zach as a pawn in his game? The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Eliminating a skilled mechanic like Darnell would weaken Vince's shop, giving Baines an edge. It was a cruel, calculated move, but it fit. The anger that had been simmering within him now flared into a raging fire. He wouldn't let this stand. He wouldn't let them destroy his life, his reputation, without a fight. He'd spent years building a career, honing his skills, earning the respect of his peers. He wouldn't let some jealous coworker and a rival shop owner tear it all down. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice now hard with a newfound resolve. "I appreciate you telling me this." He hung up the phone, the silence in the apartment now charged with a different kind of energy. The despair had begun to recede, replaced by a steely determination. He wouldn't be a victim. He would fight back. He would uncover the truth, expose the lies, and rebuild his life stronger than before. The first step, he knew, was to find proof. He had to find concrete evidence linking Zack and Baines, something that would expose their scheme and clear his name. He stood up, the weariness that had weighed him down now replaced by a surge of adrenaline. The clock on the wall ticked on, each second no longer a reminder of his loss, but a countdown to his revenge. The air in Skip's auto hung thick with the scent of old tires and motor oil, a familiar comfort to Darnell, a scent that usually settled his nerves. Not today. Today, it felt like a shroud, suffocating him. He sat on the cracked vinyl couch in Skip's small office, the Sunday quiet amplifying the roaring in his ears. The checkered linoleum floor seemed to tilt beneath him, the framed pictures of classic cars on the wall blurring at the edges. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Vince's pinched face, heard the tremor in his voice as he delivered the termination notice. Unfair. Unjust. The words echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind. Skip leaned back in his worn desk chair, the springs groaning in protest. He studied Darnell with a look that was more than concern. It was a weary understanding that Darnell couldn't quite decipher. "You look like you just buried someone," Skip said, his voice rough as sandpaper. Darnell swallowed, the dryness in his throat making it difficult. "Worse," he managed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He told Skip everything, each word a painful expulsion of the humiliation and disbelief that churned inside him. The picture, the online comments, Vince's spineless capitulation. He could feel Skip's gaze on him, heavy with unspoken thoughts. He hated this, hated the pity he saw in Skip's eyes, hated the way his own carefully constructed world had crumbled around him. Pride warred with the need to unburden himself, the internal conflict tightening his chest. Some punk took a picture, Darnell finished, the words clipped in tight. And Vince folded like a lawn chair. He rubbed a hand over his face, the gesture rough and frustrated. He'd given Vince's custom cycles 8 years of his life, 8 years of dedicated work, of building a reputation for quality and reliability. All for nothing. The thought was a bitter pill, lodging in his throat. Skip sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. He pushed a can of soda toward Darnell. "Go on, take it." Darnell stared at the can, the condensation cold against his fingertips. He wasn't sure he could stomach anything. But Skip was waiting, his silence a gentle pressure. Darnell popped the top, the fizz a small, sharp sound in the quiet. He took a long swallow, the sweetness doing little to quell the bitterness that coated his tongue. "I've seen this movie before, Darnell," Skip said finally, his voice low. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the cluttered surface of his desk. "You're black." And he was a white biker with a reputation. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Darnell looked up, his gaze meeting Skip's. He saw the truth reflected in the older man's eyes, a truth he'd been trying to avoid, trying to bury beneath layers of denial. He knew about the whispers, the sideways glances, the subtle prejudice that permeated the motorcycle world. He'd always chosen to ignore it, to believe that his skill, his hard work, would speak for itself. He'd been so naive. You think they set me up?" he asked, the question barely a whisper. The thought had flitted at the edges of his consciousness, a dark, unwelcome shadow. He hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to acknowledge the malice that it implied. Skip didn't answer directly. Instead, he recounted stories, incidents Darnell had dismissed as isolated occurrences. The unexplained delays in parts orders for his projects. The snide remarks from certain customers. The time his tools had been mysteriously misplaced. Seen individually, they seemed insignificant, mere annoyances. But strung together, they formed a disturbing pattern. Darnell listened, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The anger he'd felt towards Vince began to shift, to morph into something colder, more calculating. He'd been a fool, blinded by his own sense of fairness, by his belief in meritocracy. He hadn't seen the machinations, the subtle manipulations that had been working against him. "Trevor Baines," Skip said, the name a curse on his lips. "Reeves Body Paint." He's been trying to undercut Vince for months. This stinks of his handiwork. The name resonated with Darnell. He'd heard whispers of Bain's ruthless business practices, his willingness to do whatever it took to eliminate the competition. He remembered a particular incident, a dispute over a custom paint job that had ended with a lawsuit and rumors of sabotage. A wave of nausea rolled over Darnell. He'd been so focused on his own work, on proving himself, that he'd been oblivious to the undercurrents of rivalry and resentment swirling around him. He thought of Zach, the young mechanic who'd taken the photo, the smug look on his face. Had he been a pawn in Bain's game? Had he been manipulated? Or was he a willing participant? "I need proof," Darnell said, his voice low and steady. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a steely resolve. He wouldn't let them get away with this. He wouldn't let them destroy his reputation, his livelihood. He would fight back. Skip nodded, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "I'll help you get it," he said. "We'll find out what really happened." As Darnell walked out of Skip's auto, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, he felt a shift within him. The despair and confusion that had weighed him down were lifting, replaced by a burning sense of purpose. He had a long road ahead, a difficult battle to fight, but he wouldn't back down. He would clear his name, and he would expose those who had wronged him. The fight had just begun. The dim glow of the laptop screen painted stripes across Darnell's face, the reflected light catching the sheen of sweat on his forehead. Sunday night, a night for quiet reflection, for the gentle easing into the work week. Instead, the coil of anger in his gut tightened with every click of the mouse. He stared at the photo, Zach's smug face grinning back at him from a previous post. A bitter taste filled his mouth. He knew, deep down, that accepting the Hell's Angels bike for repair hadn't been wrong. But Vince's reaction, the swift, brutal dismissal, it felt like a betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. He scrolled through the comments below the picture of him working on Royce's bike, each one a fresh jab at his reputation. Vince is going soft, letting gangbangers in. Heard they're giving discounts to criminals now. Better watch your wallets around Vince's. The words were like shards of glass, each one designed to inflict maximum damage. A wave of exhaustion washed over him. He rubbed his eyes, the harsh fluorescent light of his kitchen seeming to amplify the throbbing in his head. He was tired, bone-tired, of fighting the whispers, the sideways glances. He just wanted to work, to lose himself in the intricate dance of metal and mechanics. His gaze lingered on a particular comment. Reeves Body Paint would never associate with such clientele. Our team keeps it clean. No gangs, no questions. Something about the blatant self-promotion, the pointed jab at Vince's, struck a dissonant chord. Reeves Body Paint, Trevor Bain's shop. Darnell had always felt a subtle undercurrent of rivalry, a sense of Bain's ambition gnawing at the edges of Vince's established reputation. He dismissed it as healthy competition, the natural push and pull of the business world. But now, looking at the comment, a cold suspicion snaked through him. Could Baines be behind this? Was it possible that this wasn't just Zach's thoughtless stupidity, but a calculated attack? The thought, once seeded, took root and bloomed with unsettling speed. He clicked on the profile of the commenter, a blank avatar staring back at him. No posts, no followers, no following. A ghost, a sock puppet. The anger simmering in his stomach began to boil. He leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking under his weight, and took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of fury. Think, Darnell, think. He needed proof, something concrete to link Baines to this orchestrated smear campaign. His fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating to Reeves Body Paint's social media page. He scrolled through their posts, a curated collection of gleaming chrome, custom paint jobs, and satisfied customers. Nothing overtly incriminating. He was about to close the tab, a flicker of disappointment rising within him, when he noticed a pattern. Several posts, seemingly innocuous, subtly mentioned Vince's, always with a veiled criticism. Quality over quantity, that's our motto. We believe in supporting local businesses, not others. Each one a carefully placed barb, designed to chip away at Vince's reputation. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was circumstantial, yes, but the pieces were starting to fit together. He remembered a conversation he'd overheard weeks ago. Zach and a couple of the other guys at Vince's talking about a job offer from Reeves. Zach had dismissed it with a laugh, saying Baines was a cheapskate, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Had Baines been trying to poach Vince's employees? Had Zach been swayed by his promises? He stood up and paced the length of his small kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath his bare feet. The air felt thick with a suffocating tension. The pieces clicked into place, forming a grim, unsettling picture. Baines, desperate to expand his business, saw Vince's as a threat. Zach, young and ambitious, easily manipulated by the promise of a better position. The Hell's Angels bike, the perfect opportunity to create a scandal, to paint Vince's as a haven for criminals. He stopped pacing, a sudden stillness settling over him. The anger hadn't dissipated, but it had coalesced into something colder, sharper resolve. He wouldn't let them get away with this. He'd spent years building his reputation, brick by painstaking brick, and he wouldn't let some jealous rival and a spineless co-worker tear it down. He returned to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He had a long night ahead of him. He needed to gather evidence, to build a case that would expose Baines' scheme and clear his name. A weary sigh escaped his lips, but beneath the exhaustion, a spark of determination ignited. He wouldn't be silenced. He would fight back. The fluorescent lights of Vince's custom cycles hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Darnell's simmering anger. Monday morning had arrived like a punch to the gut, and the metallic tang of oil and gasoline, usually a comfort, now felt like a bitter mockery. Each tool hanging neatly on the pegboard seemed to mock him, a silent testament to the life he'd built here, now shattered by whispers and lies. He gripped the manila envelope tighter, its contents a physical weight mirroring the burden in his chest. He hadn't slept. The exhaustion clung to him, a heavy cloak woven with threads of disbelief and betrayal. But beneath the fatigue, a cold, hard resolve burned. He wouldn't let this go. He couldn't. Vince's office, tucked away in the corner, felt smaller than usual, the cluttered space closing in on Darnell. Vince sat behind his desk, his face pale, his eyes avoiding Darnell's. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of Vince's pen against the blotter. A nervous habit Darnell had never noticed before, or perhaps hadn't cared to. Now, it grated on his nerves, each tap a tiny hammer blow against the fragile remnants of their professional relationship. Darnell placed the envelope on the desk, the sound sharp in the quiet. "What's this?" Vince asked, his voice strained, still avoiding Darnell's gaze. He knew. Darnell could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted with the pen. "This," Darnell said, his voice low and controlled, each word a carefully placed stone, "is everything." He could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, the pulse throbbing in his temples. But he forced himself to remain calm. He needed Vince to see, to understand the depth of the deception. He opened the envelope, spreading the contents across the desk. Screenshots of Zach's boastful messages to friends, detailing his plan to frame Darnell. Bank records showing a recent, unusually large payment from Reeves body paint to Zach. And finally, a printout of Trevor Baines' gloating post on a private online forum about the damage done to Vince's reputation. Each piece of evidence, meticulously gathered over the sleepless weekend, felt like a vindication, a small victory in the war raging inside him. Vince stared at the documents, his face draining of what little color remained. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the papers as if they were contaminated. The silence returned, heavier this time, thick with the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Darnell watched him, a strange sense of detachment washing over him. This man, who he had respected, who he had considered a mentor, was now a stranger, revealed as weak and cowardly. This is," Vince stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He finally looked up at Darnell, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. Darnell felt a flicker of something akin to pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the still burning embers of anger. "You fired the wrong man," Darnell stated, the words flat and devoid of emotion. He felt a strange hollowness where the anger had been, replaced by a profound sense of disappointment. He realized then that he hadn't come here seeking an apology. Not really. He had come seeking something more, something that Vince was clearly incapable of giving, acknowledgement of the fundamental betrayal, the casual disregard for his loyalty and hard work. Vince swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. I didn't know, he mumbled, his voice choked with something that might have been regret, or perhaps just fear for his own reputation. Darnell couldn't tell, and frankly, he no longer cared. Didn't know? Darnell repeated, the words laced with a bitter irony. He thought of the years he'd poured into this shop, the long hours, the dedication, the unwavering loyalty he'd shown. He'd given Vince everything, and in return, he'd been discarded without a second thought. The injustice of it all clawed at him, a raw, visceral pain. I just reacted, Vince continued, his voice pleading now. The online comments, the threats, I panicked. He looked at Darnell, his eyes beseeching. I had to protect the shop, Darnell. You understand, don't you? The question hung in the air, a pathetic plea for absolution. Darnell looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a mentor, not a friend, but a small, frightened man clinging to the wreckage of his own making. Understanding? Perhaps. Forgiveness? Not a chance. No, Darnell said, his voice quiet but firm. I don't understand. You chose to believe the lies rather than trust the man who'd given you years of loyal service. You chose to protect your image instead of standing up for what's right. He paused, letting the words sink in. You made your choice, Vince. And now I'm making mine. He turned and walked out, leaving Vince alone with the damning evidence and the echoing silence of his own failure. The metallic scent of the shop clung to him as he left, a final, bitter reminder of what he had lost. But as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, a strange sense of liberation washed over him. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. He would rebuild. He would prove them all wrong. He would rise from the ashes, stronger and more resilient than ever. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the nightmare began, Darnell felt a flicker of hope, a spark of anticipation for the future he would forge for himself. The stale air hung heavy in Vince's custom cycles, thick with the metallic tang of oil and the phantom roar of engines long silenced. Monday afternoon sunlight, fractured by the grime on the windows, cast long, distorted shadows across the shop floor. Darnell stood amidst the organized chaos of his workbench, each tool precisely placed, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside him. He picked up a wrench, its cool weight a small comfort in his hand, and turned a bolt on the half-disassembled engine in front of him, the rhythmic clink a fragile shield against the silence. He hadn't expected to be back here, not after Friday's humiliation, not after Vince's spineless dismissal. Yet, a stubborn ember of hope, illogical as it felt, had driven him back. He needed answers. He needed to understand how a simple act of courtesy, fixing a man's bike, could be twisted into an act of betrayal. The bell above the door jangled, the sound cutting through the quiet like a saw through metal. Darnell's hand tightened on the wrench, his knuckles whitening. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The heavy tread, the subtle leather creak, the scent of road, and something indefinably wild, it was Royce. Darnell felt a flicker of apprehension. Was he here to gloat? To rub salt into the wound? Royce stopped a few feet from the workbench, his presence filling the space. Heard what happened, he rumbled, his voice deep and resonant, echoing oddly in the deserted shop. Darnell didn't respond, focusing on the engine, tightening another bolt, the metal complaining softly under the pressure. He could feel Royce's gaze on him, heavy and intense. He knew he should say something, anything, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. Shame, a bitter taste, coated his tongue. Shame that he'd let Vince's fear dictate his actions. Shame that he'd allowed himself to be judged so easily. You didn't judge me, Royce continued, his voice quieter now, a hint of something Darnell couldn't quite place respect, maybe, laced within it. You fixed my bike. Didn't ask questions. Didn't care about the colors I wear. Darnell finally looked up, meeting Royce's gaze. The man's eyes, a startling blue against the weathered leather of his face, held a surprising depth. He wasn't here to gloat. He was here for something else. You lost your job over that, Royce went on, his voice hardening. You ever stop to ask who wanted that to happen? The question hung in the air, a sudden gust of wind in a stifling room. Darnell felt a jolt, a sudden, sickening realization. He'd been so focused on Vince's betrayal, he hadn't considered the possibility of a more calculated attack. He'd been a pawn in someone else's game. What do you mean? Darnell asked, his voice barely a whisper. The internal monologue he'd been holding at bay for days finally broke free, a torrent of questions and suspicions flooding his mind. Who would benefit from this? Who had the motive? Royce leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. Trevor Baines, he said, the name a curse. He's been trying to put Vince under for months. This was just the leverage he needed. He explained the rumors, the whispers, the carefully orchestrated campaign to paint Vince's as a haven for outlaw bikes, a place where the lines blur between legitimate business and something darker. He detailed how the photo, Zach's eager contribution, had been the final nail in the coffin, effectively scaring off Vince's more conservative clientele. Darnell listened, his mind racing. He'd heard of Trevor Baines, the owner of Reeves Body Paint, a rival shop known for its aggressive tactics and cutthroat pricing. He'd never crossed paths with the man directly, but he'd felt the ripple effect of his competitive strategies. He'd never imagined, though, that Baines would stoop to such underhanded methods. A wave of anger, hot and raw, washed over him. He'd been used, manipulated, sacrificed on the altar of Baines' ambition. He thought of Vince, cowering behind his carefully crafted image, too afraid to stand up for what was right. He thought of Zach, his youthful arrogance blinding him to the consequences of his actions. And then he thought of Royce, a man he'd judged prematurely, a man who was now offering him an unlikely alliance. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Darnell took a deep breath, the metallic scent of the shop filling his lungs. He felt a shift within him, a hardening of resolve. He wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't let Baines win. He wouldn't let Vince's cowardice define him. He would clear his name, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged, for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. He looked at Royce, a new understanding passing between them, a silent pact forged in the shared knowledge of injustice. He didn't need to speak. Royce knew. The slight nod, the almost imperceptible tightening of the man's jaw, spoke volumes. What now? Darnell finally asked, his voice steady, the tremor of anger replaced by a steely determination. The question hung in the air, not just a question for Royce, but a question for himself, a question for the future that now stretched before him, uncertain yet full of a new, dangerous possibility. The engine on his workbench seemed to hum in response, a low, steady thrum of potential waiting to be unleashed. The biting chill of Monday night seeped into Darnell's bones as he surveyed his garage. It wasn't much, just a two-car space attached to his modest home. But under the harsh fluorescent light, it felt like a sanctuary. A haven built not of brick and mortar, but of defiance and a gnawing need to prove himself. The scent of motor oil, usually a comfort, held a new edge tonight, a metallic tang of uncertainty. He ran a calloused hand over the chipped workbench, the wood smooth beneath years of use. This wasn't just a workbench. It was a testament to hours spent coaxing life back into tired engines, a silent witness to his dedication. He'd spent the last few days haunted by the echo of Vince's voice, the sting of betrayal still raw. But within the echoing silence of his own garage, a different kind of sound began to emerge, a quiet hum of resolve. He wouldn't be defined by Vince's fear or Zach's malice. He'd build something of his own, something built on honesty and hard work. He had nothing left to lose. Tuesday morning arrived, cloaked in a dense fog, mirroring the uncertainty that swirled in Darnell's gut. He'd spread the word through Skip and a few other trusted contacts, a hushed network of whispers in the local biker community. He'd half expected no one to show. Yet, there it was, a battered pickup truck pulling into his driveway, its engine sputtering a hesitant greeting. A wave of anxiety washed over him. Could he really do this? Could he face the world again after being so publicly humiliated? He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced a smile. The driver, a grizzled man with a weathered face and eyes that held a lifetime of stories, stepped out. "Heard you were wrenching again," the man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Darnell recognized him. It was Old Man Hemlock, known for his meticulous care of his vintage Harley. A sliver of hope pierced through Darnell's apprehension. "Word travels fast," Darnell replied, his voice surprisingly steady. He met Hemlock's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. No need for explanations, no need to rehash the past. This wasn't about reputation or affiliations. This was about fixing a bike. By Wednesday, a steady trickle of customers had found their way to Darnell's garage. Each arrival brought a fresh surge of both hope and trepidation. Each interaction felt like a test, a judgment on his worth. But as he worked, the familiar rhythm of tools against metal began to soothe his frayed nerves. He lost himself in the task, the intricate dance of diagnosing problems and finding solutions. He listened, truly listened, to the subtle whispers of the engines, understanding their needs with an almost intuitive grasp. A young woman, her face etched with worry, arrived with a sputtering scooter on Thursday. "I don't know what's wrong with it," she confessed, her voice tinged with desperation. "Vince's said it would take weeks to even look at it." Darnell felt a pang of empathy. He knew that feeling of helplessness, of being dismissed and ignored. "Let's take a look," he said gently. He examined the scooter with meticulous care, his mind working through the possible causes. "Your past ain't a problem here," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "We just fix things." He saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, a spark of trust kindled in the shared understanding of a problem solved. He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was what mattered. Not the flashy image or the contrived reputation, but the simple act of helping someone in need. Friday evening found Darnell slumped on a stool, exhausted but strangely exhilarated. The garage was filled with the comforting aroma of oil and gasoline, a testament to a week of hard work. The initial anxiety had given way to a quiet satisfaction. He'd faced his fears, confronted his doubts, and emerged stronger on the other side. He looked around at the space, no longer seeing a simple garage, but a symbol of his resilience. He'd built something from nothing, a testament to the power of integrity and hard work. The hum of resolve that had started on Monday had grown into a steady thrum, a resonant vibration that resonated within him. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was Darnell Cooper, the owner of his own shop, a man who stood by his principles. He hadn't just fixed bikes this week. He'd begun to fix his life. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew, with a deep, abiding certainty, that he could face whatever came his way. He had his tools, his skill, and his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. And that, he realized, was all he ever really needed. The air in Darnell's new shop still carried the sharp tang of fresh paint, a scent that clung to the corrugated metal walls like a second skin. Sunlight filtered through the grimy skylight, cast long shadows across the concrete floor, highlighting the gleaming chrome of a disassembled Harley. Darnell, grease smudged on his cheek, tightened a bolt, the wrench clicking a steady rhythm against the engine block. Each turn, each precise adjustment, felt like a small victory. A reclamation. This wasn't just rebuilding a bike. It was rebuilding his life, piece by piece. He'd named the place Cooper's Customs, a simple declaration of ownership, a quiet defiance. He hadn't sought this fight, but he sure as hell wasn't going to back down from it. The bell above the door chimed, a thin, hesitant sound that echoed in the still sparse space. Darnell glanced up, his hand still resting on the wrench. Vince stood there, looking smaller than Darnell remembered, shoulders slumped, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. The man's usual crisp attire was rumpled, his tie loosened, as if he'd wrestled with it on the drive over. Darnell felt a flicker of something, not quite satisfaction, not quite pity, but something in the gray area between. He set the wrench down, the metallic clang louder than he intended. The silence that followed seemed to stretch, thick and heavy, filled with unspoken words. Vince cleared his throat, the sound raspy. "Darnell," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, each syllable weighted with a weariness Darnell recognized. It mirrored his own exhaustion, the kind that seeped into your bones after weeks of fighting a battle you never wanted. "I came to apologize." Darnell watched him, his expression unreadable. He wasn't about to make this easy. Inside, a bitter voice echoed. Apologies didn't bring back lost jobs, lost trust, lost sleep. Apologies didn't erase the whispers and stares that followed him around town like shadows. He waited, the silence amplifying Vince's discomfort. Vince shuffled his feet, the movement awkward and out of place in the usually confident businessman. "I got scared," he finally admitted, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Darnell's shoulder. "I should have stood next to you. I knew it was bullshit." The words tumbled out, rushed and jumbled, like a dam finally breaking. Darnell felt a knot tighten in his chest. He'd imagined this conversation 1,000 times, each scenario laced with righteous anger, with the satisfaction of seeing Vince squirm. But now, facing the reality of it, the anger fell hollow. Scared of what, Vince? Of a few bikers. The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Vince winced. He finally met Darnell's gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and something akin to pleading. "Of the image, Darnell. The reputation." "You know how it is," he trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. "With people like them." Darnell knew exactly how it was. He'd lived it, breathed it, felt it like a brand searing his skin. "You didn't just fire me, Vince," Darnell said, his voice low and steady. He kept his gaze locked on Vince's, unwilling to let him escape the weight of his words. "You made it okay for everybody else to turn their backs. Suppliers, customers, hell, even some of the guys I thought were friends." Vince flinched again, as if struck. Darnell continued, the words flowing now, a torrent he couldn't contain. "You were done wrong, Vince. Trevor played you, and you folded." A week later, a local news crew had parked their van outside Cooper's Customs. The reporter, a young woman with bright, inquisitive eyes, had interviewed him, her questions sharp and to the point. Darnell had answered honestly, his words measured, each syllable carrying the weight of his experience. He spoke about the injustice, about the importance of standing up for what was right, about the power of community. He didn't mention Trevor by name, not directly. He didn't need to. The truth had a way of finding its own light. That evening, as Darnell was locking up, he found a thick envelope slipped under the door. Inside, nestled amongst a stack of newspaper clippings about the story, was a handwritten letter on Modesto Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club letterhead and a check for a substantial sum. The letter, signed by Royce, was brief and to the point. It expressed their respect for Darnell's integrity and their appreciation for his fair treatment. It was an unexpected gesture, a silent acknowledgement of a shared understanding that transcended the superficial labels and preconceived notions that had fueled the entire ordeal. Darnell leaned against the workbench, the letter in his hand, the weight of it surprisingly comforting. He wasn't naive. He knew the club had its own reputation, its own code. But in that moment, all he felt was a profound sense of gratitude. They had seen him, truly seen him, when others had chosen to look away. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and switched off the lights. The darkness that enveloped the shop wasn't the suffocating kind he'd experienced weeks before. This darkness held a promise, the quiet hum of a future he was building, brick by brick, with his own two hands. The air in Darnell's shop, once thick with the ghosts of uncertainty and the metallic tang of fear, now vibrated with a different energy. The scent of engine oil still hung heavy, a familiar comfort, but it was now interwoven with the sharper, sweeter aroma of fresh paint and the low hum of multiple projects taking shape. Weeks had bled into a blur of focused work, each sunrise greeted by the grit of determination in Darnell's gut. His new space, smaller than Vince's but infinitely more his own, was alive. Tools hung with a meticulous order that mirrored the quiet precision in Darnell's mind. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a silent ballet of renewal. He tightened a bolt on a gleaming chrome engine, the rhythmic wrenching a physical manifestation of the slow, steady rebuilding of his life. He'd thought about the injustice, the betrayal, the cold, calculating way Zach had smiled as he'd snapped that photo. The bitterness still lingered, a phantom limb twitching in his soul. But it no longer consumed him. A battered pickup truck pulled up outside, its faded paint a testament to years of hard work. A woman stepped out, her face etched with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Darnell recognized her Mrs. Henderson, whose ancient Harley had sputtered its last breath a week ago. He'd promised her a fair price, a quick turnaround, a promise he intended to keep. His reputation, once tarnished by the whispers and lies, was being forged anew, link by painstaking link, in the fires of honesty and hard work. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Darnell greeted, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He saw the flicker of relief in her eyes, the unspoken question hanging in the air. He understood. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, difficult to repair. He was learning that the hard way. "Your bike's ready," he continued, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. "Just giving it a final once-over." Mrs. Henderson's face transformed, a genuine smile replacing the worry lines. "Oh, thank you, Darnell," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a lifesaver." He offered a small nod, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. Lifesaver. The word echoed in his mind. He wasn't saving lives, just fixing bikes. But in a way, he was also fixing something within himself. He was proving that integrity wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. A shield against the darkness. He wheeled the Harley out, its engine purring like a contented cat. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened, reflecting the polished chrome and the gleaming paint. It was more than a repair, it was a resurrection. Later that day, Skip stopped by, a thermos of coffee in hand. He surveyed the bustling shop, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "Place is really hopping, Darnell," he remarked, his voice tinged with pride. Words getting around. Darnell leaned against a workbench, accepting the offered coffee with a grateful nod. "Yeah," he replied, a cautious optimism coloring his tone. "People seem to appreciate honesty." Skip chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Honesty and damn good work," he corrected, his eyes twinkling. "Don't sell yourself short." Darnell took a sip of the hot, bitter coffee, the warmth spreading through him. He'd confided in Skip about the fear that gnawed at him, the doubt that whispered in the quiet moments. Skip had listened, his silence more comforting than any empty platitudes. He'd simply reminded Darnell of who he was, what he stood for. It had been enough. The phone rang, shattering the quiet camaraderie. It was Royce. "Heard you're doing all right, Darnell." Royce's voice boomed through the receiver. "Thought I'd swing by and get that tune-up you promised." A strange sense of gratitude washed over Darnell. Royce, the man whose mere presence had sparked the chain of events that had led him here, was now a symbol of unexpected support. He represented a world Darnell had always kept at arm's length, a world of leather and chrome and a code of loyalty he hadn't understood. But he was learning. Loyalty wasn't about club affiliations. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop floor, Darnell reflected on the journey he'd taken. He hadn't chased revenge. He'd chased purpose. He'd rebuilt his life, not on the ashes of bitterness, but on the solid foundation of integrity. He thought about Vince, his former boss, the man who had chosen silence over truth. He thought about Zach, whose petty jealousy had unleashed a storm he couldn't control. And he thought about Trevor Baines, the architect of his downfall, whose own unethical practices were now being scrutinized under the harsh glare of public opinion. The world, Darnell realized, had a way of balancing the scales. He looked around his shop at the gleaming metal, the tools hanging in their designated spots, the quiet hum of the machinery. This wasn't just a place of business. It was a sanctuary, a testament to the power of perseverance, the resilience of the human spirit. He closed up shop, the silence broken only by the click of the lock. A single thought echoed in his mind, a message he wished he could shout from the rooftops. Don't be the one who stays quiet when someone's being torn down. Speak truth. Stand tall. The world needed more of that, more people willing to stand in the light, even when the shadows threatened to consume them.